Sometimes when we're trying to gain a full understanding of a certain concept that we haven't come across before, a helpful thing to do is to consider what it does not stand for. And here in this video, I'd like to take up some of the ways of thinking that stand opposed to or are barriers to critical moral deliberation. Critical moral deliberation stands opposed to or contrasts sharply with several flawed views concerning morality, which are listed in your handout, Defining Key Terms in Business Ethics, which hopefully you have in front of you. The first one is moral conformism, and we've talked a little bit about moral conformism in the previous video. It's basically the tendency for a person not to engage in critical deliberation about established norms and laws, and instead merely to follow them. Here we might just follow the decrees of authorities and or of those in positions of power without considering oneself as a moral agent who is ultimately responsible for his or her actions. Moral conformism is just adhering to conventional morality. It's following established societal norms or expectations without any question, even if they're moral. An example might be the Fugitive State Law of 1850. If we were to uphold that particular law, well, you'd be complicit with slavery, which otherwise you should consider is an immoral law. Or in the business sphere, following whatever a boss says, even though you're being instructed to carry out acts of corporate fraud. While it may be comfortable to just follow blindly the established norms of our community, institution, or organization because we don't have to think, genuine professional responsibility often requires far more. In the Nuremberg trials, whereby the Nazi officers were being prosecuted at the end of the war, most of them used the excuse that I was just following orders. This displays an incredible adherence to moral conformism. Moral relativism is another form of barrier, another way of thinking that constitutes a barrier to critical moral deliberation. And in fact, it's probably the archenemy of critical moral deliberation. This is the idea that because there's disagreement about what's right or wrong, there is no objective truth with respect to morality, and that therefore we can't make moral judgments or criticize the views, customs, norms, mores, practices, and actions of other people, organizations, cultures, societies, including our own. Relativism has several forms, respectively holding that what is logical, true, and morally correct is merely relative to cultural, historical, social, or political factors. Again, moral relativism is the view that because there's disagreement and normative conflict about what is moral, what is right and wrong among differing groups, there is no objective truth about morality, and we can't judge the actions and practices of others as either right or wrong. Relativists essentially claim that nothing is to be gained from debating and judging about morality, issues of morality. Against relativism, however, from a critical thinking standpoint, one might argue that disagreement can be positive, since even the established laws of society largely arise as a result of the working out of the normative conflicts within the society. One form of relativism, cultural moral relativism, holds that morality is just a matter of societal opinion regarding values, norms, and that whatever a culture believes, however it organizes itself, cannot be judged through rational argumentation. It would hold that cultural norms and practices and actions like cannibalism and female genital mutilation, we can't judge these as either right or wrong. Also, we wouldn't be able to judge certain horrific cases of wrongdoing as right or wrong. For example, one case where a member of the Taliban threw battery acid in the face of girls walking to school. Or another case was one in 2012 where a 15-year-old girl had been tortured by her in-laws. She was held in a basement, beaten and burned with cigarettes and hot irons, had her fingernails ripped out, and had her fingers broken, all for refusing to become a prostitute in order to support them. We wouldn't be able to judge these as morally wrong, these acts as morally wrong. We wouldn't be able to judge ideological practices like the systematic genocide of other peoples that happened in the Holocaust as morally wrong. I'm going to be visiting Auschwitz the week that I'm away, perhaps the worst of all World War II Nazi death camps, when I'm in Poland. Quite horrifically, I'm told that in several rooms and buildings on the ground will be carpets made of human hair left over from the dead bodies of the victims of the gas chamber. Who are we not to judge that these acts are immoral? While they seem to be the most horrific extreme instances of immorality, and not from the business context, we might point to some recent cases of wrongdoing therein. For example, in 2010, British Petroleum, allegedly bypassing regulations that require a blowout preventer to be used in offshore drilling, did not, they didn't heed the regulations that they needed to. They were trying to allegedly shave costs of oil production off in order to maximize the bottom line, and they made a severe miscalculation. The Deepwater Horizon's oil rig exploded and caused the second largest oil spill in world history, which affected the lives and livelihood of millions living near the Gulf of Mexico, and also damaging the marine ecosystem potentially for generations to come. Another allegation of corporate wrongdoing concerns the ongoing Fukushima crisis, potentially the biggest industrial disaster in human history. TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which in one instance reportedly exposed workers with a water spray contaminated with radioactive cesium, subjecting them to high doses of radiation. Also, there's been several allegations that TEPCO has been lying to the rest of the world for 2.5 years, concealing the extent of the damage to spent nuclear fuel rods and about the amount of contaminated water that continues to leak into the Pacific Ocean. If these allegations are factual, well, relativism would have us not be able to judge these actions as right or wrong. For example, not abiding by safety regulations, harming workers, lying, all these kinds of things we wouldn't be able to judge as either right or wrong. When a business in its operation or in its creation and marketing of goods and services continues to sell a product that's known to cause or has a substantive risk of causing serious harm to the public or to its stakeholders, simply because they're focused on the bottom line rather than on the safety of their product, should we just remain mute? When a business tries to cut costs by knowingly hiring a factory owner that uses premises that should be condemned, subjecting workers to serious workplace dangers, shouldn't we speak up? Should we just say that it's not our right to be critical and we shouldn't judge? The relativists would say that we should not judge the actions of the business persons involved as immoral when they refuse to take steps to stop the harm from coming to the public. However, as moral agents and as critical moral deliberators, we should reserve the right to evaluate actions and practices of corporations, as well as those working in them, as right or wrong. And we should, take that kind of understanding into our own workplaces. It's not that we need to go out on a vigilante moral crusade and suggest that all business corporations are immoral, but we do need to remain morally vigilant. We may not all agree on the exact right best course of action to be taken in any given situation, but we can probably agree a lot of the time as to the range of illegitimate options that shouldn't be carried out. There's sometimes a range of well-founded, well-thought-out options that could be deemed moral. We shouldn't just think that in any given situation there's just one way to act and one way and only one way to act. That would kind of be against moral imagination that we've been talking about. In any case, in discussing controversial moral issues in business, there's apt to be disagreement among us, but this shouldn't imply that we should all just merely adopt relativism and part ways, merely agreeing to disagree. Rather, the ideal that we're striving for in this course is to cultivate our skills for critical moral deliberation. It should be pointed out that the standpoint of moral relativism is that it is logically self-reflexive. It's internally contradictory. The claim that there is no objective truth concerning morality is itself a truth statement about morality. And so we are kind of spinning our tails in a vicious circle. It's a contradictory position. Whereas critical moral deliberators are going to argue that at least one statement about morality is true, which operates against as a perspective that's against moral relativism. Against moral relativism, a critical moral deliberator will also point out that it's not all disagreement out there among distinct groups and cultures. For example, most every society or culture universally has laws to outlaw acts of murder. In any case, we're going to have to revisit the issue of moral relativism if we discuss issues in international business where there may be conflicts in respect to the norms and laws belonging to different cultures and societies that multinational businesses must navigate. But we'll leave it there for now. A third way of thinking that stands in contrast to critical moral deliberation is moral subjectivism. And this is a form of moral relativism at the level of the individual. It's the standpoint that whatever any individual merely believes, has an opinion about, or feels is right is morally correct. Since it's held that there's no objective facts about morality, individuals along this, who believe in moral subjectivism or hold to this perspective, have free rein to decide what is right, and their views can't be criticized. But against moral subjectivism, ethics isn't just merely subjective taste, just like you were trying to decide whether to drink Coke or Pepsi. It's not just totally devoid of the empirical and objective standards of the natural sciences, for example. Just like the natural sciences presuppose some subjective categories, for example, like causality, and according to David Hume, there's no objective, philosopher David Hume, there's no objective, there's nothing out there in the world that is representative of the causal connection that we all imply when we talk about one thing causing another. There's no empirical basis for the concept of causality, according to David Hume. But just like the sciences presuppose some subjective categories in order to do their work, we should assume that while, yes, there is a subjective aspect to moral deliberation, there's also an objective side, an objective truth about issues of morality. For example, we have enough objective knowledge about what constitutes human health and flourishing to know what actions diminish this, and hence can be deemed immoral under normal circumstances, and what actions do not. So we have enough knowledge about what constitutes human flourishing and what contributes to it to know what we ought not to do. So that's one way of sort of dispatching moral subjectivism that critical thinkers typically employ. A fourth way of thinking that stands in contrast to critical moral deliberation is radical moral skepticism. While approaching truth claims respecting morality with a moderate degree of skepticism is indeed a part of what it means to deliberate critically, radical moral skepticism holds that the study and the development of ethical principles doesn't have the capacity to capture moral truths and or to make valuable change in the world. From this perspective, every argument concerning morality can be criticized and shown to be false. Radical moral skepticism is kind of the view that there's a crack in everything, and everybody is inherently hypocritical in terms of morals. But the critical moral deliberator is going to respond by saying, well, if you hold that there's a crack in every argument or in everything, well, is that particular truth claim that there's a crack in everything, is that true? That's a truth claim to say that there's a crack in everything. So again, radical moral skepticism is logically self-reflexive, just like relativism, according to critical moral deliberators. A radical moral skeptic might also hold to the view that business and ethics are totally incompatible, and that as such the whole topic is not worth discussing, but we don't need to entertain the skeptic on that note. The fifth way of thinking that stands in contrast to critical moral deliberation is psychological egoism. And this is the view that we're somehow psychologically incapable of acting in any other way than that based in accord with our own self-interest. It's the view that human beings are by nature selfish, and genuine altruism or acts of genuine altruism or care for others simply do not exist. It's the view that even actions that appear to be genuinely altruistic or selfless can always be shown to have selfish motives behind them. One person that comes to mind in sort of representing what psychological egoism is all about is a guy named Richard Dawkins. You've probably heard of him. He's got a book that's entitled The Selfish Gene, in which it's assumed that we are, from biological perspective, only motivated by the prospect of reproducing our genes, and that all our actions, even those that seem to be altruistic, are just a byproduct of that one motive or drive. that selfish motive or drive. An example of an attempted justification of psychological egoism would be to point out the true underlying selfish motive of somebody carrying out an altruistic act like helping an elderly grandmother across the street. The psychological egoist would try to point out that you're only doing that because, say, you want to impress the grandmother's daughter, or you want to feel good about yourself. That's the only, you have a selfish motive underlying all altruistic acts. Another example of psychological egoism would involve taking a course, the idea that we should take a course in business ethics only to prevent litigation against one's firm, rather than to do the right thing. Or we're taking business ethics just to establish a corporate reputation for humanitarian concerns so as to maximize profits. These attempted justifications aside for psychological egoism, we should be open to the claim that at least one, and perhaps many, genuinely altruistic acts have been carried out in the history of the world. A sixth barrier to critical moral deliberation is ethical egoism. And this is the view that the pursuit of self-interest is synonymous with the pursuit of the good, and hence the pursuit of self-interest is in accord with what is moral. An example of a person espousing this kind of view is perhaps Ayn Rand. She might be somebody who comes to mind as attempting to justify ethical egoism. The idea that anytime somebody pursues their own self-interest and profit, they're doing what's right. However, in counteracting ethical egoism, I would expect that there are many examples of individuals acting so as to pursue maximal profits for themselves and operating fraudulently in doing so. For example, we've all heard of the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme that fell apart. So ethics and self-interest are arguably separable to a fairly great extent. There's a nice little section on psychological egoism and ethical egoism in your text from pages 12 to 17, should you wish to explore these egoistic barriers to critical moral deliberation a little bit more. But in preparation for the next video lecture, please take a look at the article in your course pack by Michael Bayliss entitled, What is a Profession?